todos que estão já participando aqui do preparativo, com conexão com o Dr. Paul lá em Kansas. E então eu gostaria de dar as boas-vindas a todos, vamos dar início ao Fórum de Interdisciplinaridade do mês de agosto, em que o tema será o sistema de saúde como um sistema complexo e o papel da interdisciplinaridade. Então, eu gostaria de rapidamente dizer para vocês que o professor João está sentado ali. Esse semestre, o curso de medicina teve uma formatação diferente para uma disciplina bastante interessante, que é a disciplina de aproximação à prática médica. Na verdade, é a aproximação à prática médica 3. Né? E nesse semestre, então, surgiu uma oportunidade dos alunos discutir e conhecer uma série de grupos de pesquisa, né, e visitar esses grupos e discutir o que tinha sido feito. E uma dessas oportunidades foi exatamente de refletir sobre o que era feito de pesquisa interdisciplinar em vários dos grupos, como, por exemplo, o grupo da professora Thaís Russomano, sobre microgravidade, né, o Instituto do Cérebro, o Instituto de Pesquisas Biomédicas, que nasceu de uma ideia de fazer interdisciplinaridade, e não sei se estou esquecendo algumas, enfim, vários grupos que serviram para essa reflexão. E então, numa dessas reflexões, a gente descobriu uma experiência extremamente interessante, que foi exatamente liderada pelo Dr. Paul Ullich, lá na época que ele fez isso no Hospital de Concord, né, em New Hampshire. E então nós apresentamos aos alunos a experiência deles, os alunos discutiram uma série de situações, problemas que eles evidenciavam na prática clínica diária. Dr. Paul Ullich é um cirurgião cardíaco e, na verdade, a partir disso fizemos o contato com ele e houve a ideia, né, de programarmos esse fórum. O meu companheiro da disciplina, o professor Guilhermano, que é professor da psiquiatria, também atua no atendimento aos pacientes, na internação. Então, a gente conversando sobre esse modo de trabalhar interdisciplinar, imediatamente tivemos a ideia de convidá-lo, e agradeço muito o professor Guilhermano por estar aqui hoje conosco, para que ele, no final, depois da palestra do professor Ullich, ele possa fazer as suas considerações sobre esse tema. É muito interessante notar que os alunos tiveram várias oportunidades de discutir interdisciplinaridade na pesquisa e, com essa situação propiciada pela experiência lá do professor Ullich no modelo Concord, de discutir interdisciplinaridade na prática de atenção à saúde, que não é exatamente necessariamente só de pesquisa. Eu acho que isso é extremamente interessante. Só faltou um aspecto que a gente discutiu, talvez fora da aula formal, com os alunos, inclusive, que foi a questão da interdisciplinaridade no ensino de graduação. Isso é uma coisa que os alunos têm cada vez mais falado, é um assunto para que nós possamos fazer avançar também. Os alunos frequentemente vêm nos perguntar, mas que legal que, né, o pessoal aqui do determinado grupo trabalha já com vários saberes integrados. Quando é que nós vamos ter isso na aula de graduação? Então, isso aí fica um pouquinho mais para adiante. So I would like to introduce Professor Dr. Paul Ullich. Paul, are you currently at Kansas University, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
So please, we are anxious to hear your experience with the collaborative Concord model.
Well, Carlos, I'm very honored to speak with you all today. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
See maybe a head nod or something like that, so I'm knowing I'm connecting with somebody. Wonderful. So I'm calling from Wichita, Kansas, which is my home. That's where I grew up. I'm a cardiac surgeon and very interested in the future of healthcare. I would like for you to consider me as a colleague. All across the world, we are working hard to try to understand what healthcare is going to become. I've increasingly come to understand that this is a time of very profound transformation in healthcare. The way that I was trained and the way that perhaps you are still being trained, because certainly we still train our practitioners very much as we always have for many decades. Those ways are no longer working all across the world in terms of cost and quality and access to care and experience of care. And so much of my work over the last 10 or 15 years has been trying to understand even better ways of teams working together with patients and families to give care. I wanted to take one moment just to say a very fun day for me today, because we have 4 sons, and our second son, Carl, is starting medical school today at Stanford. It was his very first day today. So I was out there on Friday, and they had a little ceremony where he was given a stethoscope and a white coat, and so it was very fun to be with him for that out in California. So what I'd like to do is to minimize my spoken comments and have the most opportunity for us to have a conversation. But I did prepare just a few slides to show you kind of the evolution of our work. When Carlos called me, a lot of that was based on work that we had received an award for over 10 years ago now, when I was at Concord Hospital and on the faculty at Dartmouth Medical School. Are you able to see, Carlos, the PowerPoint presentation now?
Yes, it's on the screen right now.
Okay, so if we can advance, and I hope that I have your logo right. I went on the internet and found that, and so I put our two logos side by side, so I hope that's
perfect.
Good, okay. But we can go to the next slide. And this is the slide of the article that Carlos probably read, and it was describing the award we received for some work transforming the way that our cardiac surgery team worked together. The people on the right side are some of the caregivers on that team. This slide was taken about 5 years ago when I visited them again. And it's not a great picture, but I love this picture just because of the spirit of these wonderful people. And what we had done is, this was very early in the work. Some of you may be aware that there are efforts to try to use principles from human factor science and aviation safety to change the way that care teams work together. And when we first did this work of bringing an entire collaborative team together with patients and families to make our rounds, we really thought that what we were doing was following the principles of human factor science and crew resource management. And we got really remarkably better outcomes. We had half of the deaths and complications that we had had before in a program that was already really quite good. And we had extremely happy patients and families. Our heart surgery patients became happier than the mothers having babies in our hospital. And so we wrote about it this way. But then a few years later, as people tried to copy what we had done, the uptake was extremely uneven. Some programs got some better. Very few programs got a lot better and got the same outcomes that we had had. And many programs didn't change very much at all. And so if we can go to the next slide, Carlos. We really began to understand that we were missing something, that we did not fully understand what was underlying what we had done. And this slide shows 2 photographs of a blending of our clinical team and a research team that we were able to put together, a social science research team, to sort of study this collaborative care process. And what we had been able to successfully do was to create this very level hierarchy among our team with extremely active participation of patients and families in the care process. Every morning, all of our patients on the cardiac surgery service, beginning in the intensive care unit and then moving out to the step-down area, we would have this daily collaborative rounds. And as the research team began studying this, and you can see the team conferred in that lower left, analyzing data and talking among ourselves about what we had done, they began to point us in a different direction. they sort of said, we think we have a better understanding and explanation of why this was so successful. And what I wanted to do is just sort of summarize some of these new insights that we've been adding to and applying in the years since. So we'll go to the next slide. And this is a colleague of mine, probably my closest professional colleague. Her name is Ellen Reboyne. And Ellen's PhD is in human and organization systems. And Ellen is a social constructionist. And I don't know how many of you know of social construction, but it's a way of understanding the world that emphasizes our interactions and our conversations with each other. And social constructionists believe that in our interactions and conversations, we actually create the realities that we experience, that we decide what matters, what has meaning, what makes sense, by constantly testing and refining these understandings. And so what Ellen helped us understand was that instead of a transactional world of people talking and communicating, and that's very much the way that people work in healthcare in terms of trying to make it better. There'll be things that you will probably be taught, such as reading back and being very explicit and precise about what you're saying when you communicate and so forth. She and others helped us see that what we were really creating was a social field, a living intelligence that surrounded a very local group of people that had an opportunity to meet and talk and reflect and work together on a consistent basis. If I look at all of you sitting in your classroom right now, there's probably a social field around you, shared experiences, things that if someone were to say something, the rest of you would smile or nod, that I would have no access to, because not only because of language barriers, but because I've not had that lived history that we've had together. And what Ellen has really, with her PhD dissertation about the social construction of collaborative practice, and then further work, has really helped all of us understand how important these local, historical accomplishments are of people who are able to work consistently together. Next slide. So this is the way that we believe that collaborative practice arises. It is a constant cycles of action and reflection, that we act together in the care of the patient, but in the really effective collaborative care environments, we also have regular opportunities for reflection, where this same team sits down together, not to say, how did this patient do, but to say, how are we doing as a team? How did we do last week in the care of these patients? What can we do even better this week? And this constant cycling between action and reflection creates the learning and the growth that creates what Ellen refers to as contextual resources, the ability of a team to know what to expect or how to respond or what to do. That collaborative practice actually makes sense now to this team because people across professions have been sitting down and working together. So this idea that we are socially constructing in our local environments the capacity to give this exceptional care. So I'm going to go to the next slide now, and this slide has three little photographs with some line drawings above. We believe that collaborative practice is very much a local accomplishment, and that you cannot tell people that they have to practice this way, that it really is an invitation to people to work in these ways. And so these pictures show the actual evolution of a clinical team in one of our hospitals here, beginning with a very small group of people that had the inspiration to begin to work in this way, in this case a physician leader and a nursing leader. And then they began to draw others toward this way, and gradually they developed this weekly system meeting, this opportunity for them to sit down together. And notice that some of you are eating. And if you look in this picture, you'll see a table with some food. We found that food is very important for sort of leveling the hierarchy and allowing people to interact together. So collaborative practice, we believe, begins with invitations. I'm going to go to the next slide. This shows two different clinical teams, members of two different clinical teams, one in a smaller hospital in the northern part of our state and one in a large major referral center. But look at their smiles and their passion, just in the same way that I see in all of you. And collaborative practice is about the human spirit. And go into this with that foremost in your mind. And everything that you're doing is basically building a home for the human spirit, the deep dedication of each of us in healthcare to do the very best that we can to care for our patients and for each other. Next slide is this clinical team. This is an actual clinical team that I was a part of. This is not at Concord. This is at a replication of Concord here in Kansas. But this is what is usually missing in most healthcare environments, are these opportunities on a regular basis, at least every week, for the same clinical team that cares for patients to sit down together and talk and make sense and get to know each other. And this, we call this relational infrastructure. It is an infrastructure that allows productive working relationships to form. And this is, if you, at least in my experience across many years now in many settings, is there is almost never this sort of low hierarchy, relaxed place for people to sit down together on a regular basis, woven into the normal work life. And the most important intervention to build collaborative practice is to create these opportunities for shared reflection. Next slide. So this shows a clinical team with a patient and his brother. His wife was embarrassed because she'd been up all night, and so she's hiding in the window back behind. She wanted to, but you can see her hands are around the waist of the physical therapist and the care coordinator. This active engagement of patients and families in care is absolutely transformational. It is a leveling of hierarchy. Not that we, with our white coats, are here and patients are here, not that we are sacrificing ourselves to them, but that we are all even. We are working hard to help them, and they are working equally hard to help us, and all of us together are co-creating care. And this change that comes on a clinical team as patients and families are actively engaged as co-participants in creation of care is very striking. Next slide. One of the things that's been very exciting over the last 5 years has been the power of simulation for helping to produce interprofessional understandings. And here we have actually two different settings. On the top two pictures are interprofessional teams working together around a mannequin. You can see the different interprofessional team members, respiratory therapy, nursing, physician, working together in the upper left. Importantly, in the picture on the upper right, the woman in the middle in the gray is a family member. We always try to have a family presence in any of our simulation activities. And you can see how she's being integrated into the simulation as the students are responding to her as well as to the patient. But equally importantly, in the bottom, you can do, simulation is such a broad, diverse area. And here in this case, we have a person playing the role of a patient. We have a person playing the role of his daughter as a family member. We have care team members who are gathered around and just trying out different ways of working together as an interprofessional team and interacting with patient and family. In this case, Dr. Brumfield, who's sitting on the bed, made the decision to sit rather than stand. And in the debriefing of this, then they discussed how that felt to be sitting rather than standing over the patient and family. And over the course of about 2 hours of working together, this team just totally was able to transform the way that it worked together and become very, very comfortable. And this was just done in an empty patient room with a hospital gown that the actor pulled on. He's actually a retired physician who was acting in the role of the patient. But just the power of simulation is amazing for creating these opportunities to experience the world differently, which then allows this social construction of collaborative practice. The next slide. This is a very exciting slide for me. These are interprofessional students. These are medical students, nursing students, allied health students, respiratory therapy, physical therapy, and others. We're part of a program called Clarion, and it's a program for interprofessional education where from the very beginning of the education process, opportunities are created for interprofessional teams to work together. In this case, this is a national competition out of the University of Minnesota, and we put together a team from several of the schools in our community. They prepared for several months and then went to this competition and actually won third place nationally with this. But again, this is building the infrastructure of just people to sit down together, work together, visit together, talk together, make sense of the world differently. Our students report that they are changed forever by these experiences of working together, both in simulation and in these activities such as Clarion. Next slide. So this is an interprofessional team of a friend of mine. He's standing at the back. His name is Michael. Our names sound kind of phonetically similar. His last name is Kulik. My name is Ulig. But Michael and his team have built an interprofessional model in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. But this kind of the center around their work is Toyota Production System and Lean. But what it does is accomplishes the same thing. It gives them opportunities to sit and meet and interact. And so if you take these general principles of creating opportunities for people to reflect together, to develop structured patterns for working together, get to know each other, then you can add in anything, for example, TPS or Lean or Six Sigma, and I'm sure you're familiar with all of these efforts to use quality improvement methodologies to improve healthcare. If you just go directly to the quality improvement project and you miss these infrastructure elements, then you get something usually very different and usually much less effective. So the next slide has a list of 8 different points that we consider from our research and work over the last 10 years to be an infrastructure for high reliability collaborative care. And the first is simply to create staffing and work structures and scheduling structures that allow a stable group of people across professions to work together. And this is much harder done than said, but it can be accomplished, and it's the cornerstone. Because if you simply have ad hoc teams where people come together because their schedule as a physical therapist assigned them to this floor on this particular day, and they're never going to be back there again, then you simply cannot generate the kind of local, historical, social field that allows exceptional care to take place. So it's just simply the interventions that allow people to begin to think in terms of groups and collectives rather than individual roles. The second is collaborative leadership. I heard in the tone of Carlos a most wonderful, soothing, calm, kind way of interacting with you all. And this kind of leadership is extremely important. It's a nurturing rather than a directive kind of leadership that recognizes and models the kind of collaboration that we're trying to create. The next is developing consistent patterns for your daily work together. And the next is the regular opportunities for shared reflection. So daily collaborative rounds and weekly team meetings. Active engagement of patients and families. Number 6 and number 7 are ways of helping your team to learn what we call down and in data. Information that your team might want to know about how did we do last week in the care of this particular patient or this population of patients. And a glitch process is a very interesting little thing that we developed at Concord. We abbreviate glitch as gathering little insights that can help. And what we mean by that is we just simply ask every patient and every family member in our team every day, is there anything at all that could have gone different or better? And we don't usually try to solve those right away, but we harvest those and bring them back to our weekly team meeting where we can fit them into patterns and try to create system-level improvements that will make those glitches not happen again. And the last point, number 8, is really important, strong connections with the rest of the organization. Because at least in the US, most healthcare organizations are structured quite directively and hierarchically, and this is something very different than that. And what we found over and over is that you can bring this local unit to an amazing kind of life. And then if you're not very proactive, it will start bumping into every existing organizational process in your healthcare organization. and often will fail because of the misfit between the way that organizations are structured now and this very different kind of frontline driven learning organization that we've created. I want to close with just a picture of the team from Wesley Medical Center here in Wichita. You can see at the top the weekly meetings that we created. The middle is the daily collaborative rounds at the bedside of a patient with family engagement. And the bottom is just this team. And just look at the, through the pride and the sense of cohesion and connectedness across the professions of these teams. This is an 18-month accomplishment. It takes that period of time to build these things. On the right is a data slide of some of the changes that were made. If you look in the lower left of that data slide, you will see several different things that we were trying to improve. Discharge on statins, discharge on beta blocker, discharge on aspirin. The little blue marks are the failures, and you can see that they gradually went away, and the little run lines are basically moving from about 80, doing these things about 80% of the time to 100% of the time. As we did this, our overall composite quality score compared to national percentiles went from very bad, 6th percentile, embarrassingly bad, to 30th, to 47th, to 58th percentile nationally over an 18-month period as we began to implement and build these changes and build this dynamic social field. The last slide is just an invitation to join with us in this. There is a group of us, we call ourselves the Collaborative Care Alliance. Our website is cca-home.org. We've adopted this little logo of birds on the wire because we hope that you will fly and join us, and that you will feel free to come and go as you wish. But increasingly, we're trying to develop the scholarship around this and the practice around this, and we would be so honored to work and learn together with you. So that's the formal presentation that I have for you, and I wanted to then make sure we have plenty of opportunity for the other speaker today, and then also for any questions at all. And I'm hopeful for an interactive discussion with you. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Paul. That's very nice. And we are going to hear now Professor Guilherme Mano. He's a psychiatrist of our local hospital, and he will present some ideas about how interdisciplinary work can make things better. I'm afraid that he will speak in Portuguese, but I hope you can wait a little bit so that we can have some time for discussions after his talk.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Boa tarde. Eu agradeço o convite do Dr. Carlos Greve Teixeira. Cumprimento o colega norte-americano. Lamento não ter fluência em inglês para poder falar na sua língua. E esse assunto surgiu de uma conversa com o Dr. Greve, quando nós conhecemos. Ele me perguntou sobre o meu campo de trabalho na universidade, como é que funcionava a interdisciplinaridade, qual a importância do intercâmbio entre diferentes disciplinas. Bom, eu fui o diretor executivo da Unidade de Internação Psiquiátrica do nosso hospital até 1990, desde 1984 até 1990. Atualmente eu estou dedicado mais ao ensino, mas eu estou bem integrado com a equipe e conversei com o professor Paulo Zimmermann, que é o chefe do serviço, o Dr. Marco Antônio Pacheco, que é o diretor da Unidade de Internação, antes de vir aqui. Eu não estou vindo aqui por minha conta, estou representando o serviço de alguma forma. Bom, a curiosidade é a seguinte: nós temos uma pequena unidade de internação psiquiátrica no Hospital Geral desde 1983 com 18 leitos. Temos uma grande universidade, as diferentes áreas da medicina e outras disciplinas que podem nos ajudar. Uma das curiosidades assim, surgida, eu levo à visita na nossa unidade de internação alunos do primeiro ano da faculdade. A primeira coisa que surpreende esses alunos que estão chegando à faculdade de medicina, ao entrar na nossa unidade de internação psiquiátrica, e sempre é bom, assim, olhos novos, enxergando as coisas, né? Porque nós podemos nos acostumar com os ambientes, acostumar com coisas que não são tão boas e vão ficando normais para nós. E os jovens trazem essa novidade, assim, eles se surpreendem como os nossos pacientes permanecem sem atividade dentro da internação, mais acamados ou ociosos, né? E os doentes psiquiátricos, normalmente, diferente dos doentes clínicos cirúrgicos, eles têm saúde, eles podem deambular, mas eles circulam pela unidade, que é um espaço relativamente pequeno, mas de forma não monitorada, não terapêutica, né? E, por outro lado, existe uma sala de equipe, que todos os membros da equipe, em geral, estão agrupados ali, e caracterizando bem assim, uma grande interação da equipe com a própria equipe e dos pacientes com os próprios pacientes, em 2 blocos. Isso acontecia também quando eu era diretor executivo, e na época nós tínhamos um grande esforço assim, para tentar integrar os pacientes com a equipe de atendimento, organizando um quadro de horários com atividades onde cada um tinha que saber onde estava em cada momento. Tá? Mesmo nós temos estagiários da psicologia, que é uma outra forma de interdisciplinaridade. Os estudantes de psicologia, supervisionados por professores, vão aprender conosco, nos ensinar também na unidade de internação psiquiátrica, mas eles acabam caindo no costume, na cultura da unidade e se agrupando com os nossos residentes, pós-graduados de psiquiatria, em conversas entre colegas, trocas de ideias teóricas, bacanas, sobre psiquiatria, psicodinâmica e tal. E há uma certa fobia em relação à doença mental, à ansiedade, à depressão, que é transmitida pelos doentes. Bom, como resolver isso aí? O que se pode fazer? Então, a questão está aqui para todos nós pensarmos juntos. Em 1988, eu apresentei o trabalho de conclusão de curso em psiquiatria sobre um estudo de unidades psiquiátricas do Hospital Geral. Eu encontrei um estudo muito interessante, dois autores, Samson Fisher e Desmond Poole, da Austrália Ocidental. Eles estudaram o comportamento de uma unidade psiquiátrica e colocaram um pesquisador tomando nota onde estariam as pessoas em cada local geográfico da unidade. Constataram a mesma coisa que a gente observa aqui. Pacientes ficam num território e no outro território ficam os membros da equipe. E raramente um grupo invade o território do outro. A interação entre paciente e paciente é muito maior que entre paciente e técnico. A interação técnico-técnica é muito maior do que com os pacientes. Então, e os pacientes melhoravam. Então, isso dá uma ideia que há um potencial terapêutico na interação paciente com paciente. Bom, então, isso hoje, eu penso que seria muito interessante, se poderia fazer hoje com GPS, que cada membro da equipe, pelo menos por uma semana, pudesse usar um GPS, cada paciente também um GPS, e mapeá-los, né, onde eles estão e quando é que eles interagem. Bem, nós também, em termos de interação, tivemos uma época uma experiência de estagiários de educação física, dando recreação, educação física, expressão corporal na unidade de psiquiatria, e depois deixou de existir. O nosso atual diretor da unidade de internação não entendeu por que deixou de acontecer essa interação, até que descobriu que nós tínhamos uma enfermeira muito zelosa do seu trabalho e ela proibiu os estagiários de educação física de terem acesso aos segredos dos pacientes, a ler os prontuários e diagnósticos dos pacientes. Bom, isso foi um racha e simplesmente a educação física deixou de frequentar a unidade de psiquiatria. E o chefe da internação foi descobrir isso muito tempo depois. Então, são coisas assim de tentativas de associação e dissociações que ocorrem dentro da mesma universidade. Seria um ganho para as diferentes disciplinas estar juntas. Existe toda a possibilidade física, possibilidade, interesse e interação, mas existem forças dispersoras, dissociativas, né, que levam a frustrar certas tendências de aproximação. Então, acho que tem que ser um esforço contínuo. Né? A interdisciplinaridade não é fácil. Né? Eu, frequentemente, estou tentando trabalho de consultoria e ligação do hospital. Acho que é muito difícil aproximar partes. Né? Eu faço parte de uma associação gaúcha de história da medicina, que tem que integrar médicos e historiadores. Também não é uma coisa nada fácil. Surgem diferenças. Né? E a nossa unidade de internação é muito pequena, está persistindo desde 1983. Foi a primeira unidade de psiquiatria em Hospital Geral Universitário de Grande Porte, no Rio Grande do Sul. Antes só existiam os hospitais militares, da Brigada, na base aérea de Canoas. E ela nunca fechou. Ela já diminuiu de tamanho, já aumentou, mas está sempre... Agora tem uma época assim que vamos pensar em crescer, expansão, a carência de leitos psiquiátricos em todo o Brasil, mas para isso nós, psiquiatras, vamos precisar de ajuda dos colegas, de médicos e de outras disciplinas para termos mais recursos assim para oferecer. E a principal coisa que preocupa assim, aos olhos dos jovens alunos do primeiro ano da faculdade, que chegam na internação, fazem o diagnóstico direto, assim, por que os pacientes ficam tão acamados, por que estão tão sozinhos, por que parece estar ociosos sem receber um tratamento, pelo menos organizado, assim, em termos de ambientoterapia. Claro que recebem medicação, recebem psicoterapia, mas o paciente internado, principalmente psicótico, para ele a coisa mais importante não é atendimento psicoterápico individual em uma sessão, é o tempo todo, a ambientoterapia. E também o quanto deixam de aprender os nossos residentes e pós-graduandos na medida em que deixam de conviver com os pacientes, limitando-se apenas a atendimentos individuais. Fazem muito, fazem diagnóstico, fazem atendimento semiológico, fazem abordagem psicoterápica, mas em termos de convívio, o que esses autores da Austrália tinham detectado naquele momento é que os profissionais que mais perto ficavam do paciente, que mais tempo passavam junto com o paciente, eram os que melhor conheciam em detalhe o funcionamento da pessoa, do paciente. Então, eu considero muito importante o técnico de enfermagem como um dos agentes principais na ação terapêutica da unidade psiquiátrica. Então, na verdade, assim, a função terapêutica é da unidade como um todo e da equipe como um todo, e não só do psicoterapeuta. Ele alertava, outros autores alertam para o perigo assim, de priorizar a psicoterapia como se o psicoterapeuta estivesse numa torre de marfim, onde o psicoterapeuta se fecha com o paciente por 45 minutos numa sala, e lá são elaboradas coisas fantásticas a respeito de psicodinâmica, e o resto do horário, nas 24 horas ou ao longo da semana, não acontecem coisas importantes. Não, é bem ao contrário. Tem tratamento internado, tratamento o tempo todo e agido, praticado por toda a equipe, não só por um especialista. Bem, acho que é isso para comentar.
Obrigado, professor Guilhermano. So, I don't know if you see me, Paul, now?
Absolutely. Pleasure.
Just a very brief summary of what Professor Guilhermano has just presented is his idea that the psychiatric ward at the hospital could perhaps benefit a little more from the variety of activities and the several opportunities perhaps to improve quality of care of these patients. That was a brief summary and his ideas and his perhaps at some time proposal for more interdisciplinary work with the care of the patients. Is that right? So now, open for questions. You may, quem quiser pode fazer em português, a gente traduz para o Dr. Paul. Comentários, questões. O microfone está aqui à disposição, aqui o colega.
Acho que não precisa do microfone.
Precisa por causa da gravação, para o professor ouvir.
Boa tarde. Eu sou originário aqui do IGG, do mestre Moriguchi, do Dr. Nilton Terra, e tenho alguma preocupação, principalmente com as patologias mentais dos idosos, mas o que eu gostaria mesmo de colocar em pauta são os padrões consistentes de interação. Como resolver essa interação, que deve ser bem aperfeiçoada, já que o resultado final seria a vida, pelo menos salvar a vida, né, em relação a um sistema que se torna mesmo... Em certos modos, ele é pervertido. Como, por exemplo, alto custo de medicamentos, diagnósticos, agora veio o DSM-5. Existia uma chance muito grande de qualquer problema de toque dizer que era toque. Agora já existe o transtorno obsessivo explosivo, que surgiu agora. E assim, coisas que vão surgindo que não estão bem fixadas ainda, pelos próprios profissionais. Isso é que me preocupa.
Essa question para o professor Guilhermano.
A classificação de doença mental está em eterna evolução, discussão permanente, não é uma coisa estabelecida. Nossa ciência é das mais inexatas e menos pronta da medicina. A psicofarmacologia é uma ciência muito recente, desde 1952 com a própria vacina. Então, acho que nós temos que colaborar, falando em interdisciplinaridade, também assim, com todo o saber médico do hospital, com bioquímicos, com os farmacêuticos, né? Isso, o Hospital Geral dá ampla oportunidade. Né? Tanta coisa que nós podemos pensar, né? Abre-se mais esse raio aí, né, de interação. A grande preocupação que trouxe aqui foi essa da convivência e de nós termos, assim, ao lado do hospital, um centro de educação física enorme, né, frequentado por tantos professores e alunos, e o que nos impede de nos aproximar e de termos profissionais de recreação nos ajudando a mobilizar os pacientes e nós mesmos, dentro da própria enfermaria, porque ficamos tão distantes dos pacientes por tantos momentos. Por que é difícil, assim, que os jovens possam jogar cartas com o paciente, jogar ping-pong, ou assistir televisão e comentar, ou observar o que acontece na televisão? Então, é porque é muito angustiante a doença mental, é muito sofrida e não é fácil para que os jovens convivam, estejam expostos a tamanha insalubridade o tempo todo. Então, teremos que aprender, né, com os profissionais da psicologia, estratégias, né, para que seja menos sofrido, que haja alguma higiene mental para os nossos profissionais, para que eles consigam ir ao contato do paciente e, ao mesmo tempo, se retirar estrategicamente, em alguns momentos, para recuperar o fôlego e tentar de novo. Eu tenho intercâmbio também com profissionais de recreação. Eu trabalhei na Clínica Pinel, no Hospital de Porto Alegre, como estagiário interno em medicina. Então, havia um esquema de comunidade terapêutica, trazendo a Clínica Mendes, nos Estados Unidos, pelo Dr. Marcelo Bryan. Lá havia uma estratégia, assim, de cada profissional da equipe tinha uma atividade e tinha que exercer essa atividade num dado horário do dia, junto com os pacientes. Então, isso, de uma certa forma, ele não precisava interagir com o paciente exposto à própria doença do paciente, tinha uma atividade meio, por exemplo, fazer esculturas em argila, ou pinturas em aquarela. Então, através daquela atividade, se convivia com os pacientes numa mesa, se observava as manifestações do paciente, mas não se estava sendo exposto assim, toda a carga de loucura que o paciente podia expressar. Então não era uma psicoterapia permanente, tinha uma atividade meio. Então isso de criar uma atividade meio, que tem uma constância, um horário que seja sempre o mesmo técnico com a mesma atividade, era uma estratégia muito interessante, que poderia ser trazida aqui para cá. Nós tivemos terapeuta ocupacional aqui na nossa unidade há bastante tempo, mas assim, questões de custos, questões de obrigações trabalhistas, tudo isso acaba dificultando de ter toda a equipe profissionalizada. Então, sendo aqui um hospital universitário, nós talvez possamos contar assim, com o treinamento acadêmico das diferentes áreas, e isso minimize custos, que se ofereça às outras unidades a possibilidade de treinamento. Eu acho que é assim que um hospital universitário pode sobreviver, já que nossa unidade tem pacientes previdenciários, outros pacientes são de planos de saúde que pagam pouco, a diária psiquiátrica. Então, sendo um hospital universitário, a atividade de ensino e treinamento possibilita que mais pessoas de outras áreas estejam presentes, estejam em treinamento e ganhem ali o aprendizado. Então, essa acho que é a proposta da interdisciplinaridade dentro da universidade, não é isso?
I have a question for Professor Yuli. Basic question. When the research, when the team meets and discuss about what has been done with the patients in the previous week and so on, what sort of discussions you guys have? Because, I mean, you have a nurse that has to give certain medication at regular intervals, and she gives it. And you have a respiratory therapist who must come by and twice a day and perform whatever he has to do, and so on. So everybody's doing their stuff. What's the extra that this dynamic adds to the work? I know it's a basic question, but it's sort of logical. Probably you've heard it a lot of times. And the other thing is how much of voluntary work and how much institutional work, which means paid hours. How's the balance between the team and the activities you perform? Because that also has a lot to do with the healthcare system nowadays, and it's always been, but nowadays even more heavier, the cost. So how do you balance those sort of things?
Right, these are excellent questions, and I'm at home, and so our little dogs are barking upstairs, so if you hear a little noise, I think my sons are just arriving from work, so if you hear some extra noise in the background, that's what's happening here. Your first question was interesting to me. There's a shift that takes place, and certainly did for us, between thinking of our actions as individual actions. The nurse gives the medicine, or the physical therapist helps the patient with activity. The physician examines the patient or writes an order. To envisioning ourselves as a team. And this transition from individual to collective is part of what we're discussing. The team itself develops an intelligence. It's not only a cognitive intelligence, but it's an emotional intelligence that is in addition to the capabilities of each individual person. Patients identify with the team as well as with the individual members of the team. And this intelligence that develops among all of us becomes quite breathtaking. I thought that I was a very good doctor and that I would sort of know everything that was happening. And yet, in the presence of this extraordinary interprofessional team, I was humbled every day by the things that I was missing or not seeing, because someone else from a slightly different perspective was, number one, able to see it, and number two, because of the team context, was able to communicate it or put it out so that all the rest of us could interact with that, same way with patients and families. So the conversations, these meetings, these weekly meetings, are deliberately run not like a formal meeting. In a formal meeting, there would be a leader who would be sitting at the head of the table and saying, here's our agenda for today, and how did we do on this or that. We intentionally run these meetings very differently. We bring food, we invite this sort of more flatter sense of hierarchy and participation. The formal leaders step back and are present and participating, but not guiding and directing. We invite others from middle or lower levels of traditional hierarchy to actually run the meeting. There is a much more informal sense of just let's check in with each other. How is everybody doing? My son just started medical school, or my daughter is getting married next week, or just little things like this. And what teams uniformly say is, we've worked together for 20 years, and until we started doing this, there was so much about each other that we did not know. And so part of it is just simply this new relational connections that are forming among people. But it goes much more than that in terms of this shift toward really identifying ourselves as a collective team. And I can talk more about that, but I want to be very respectful of time, but it should give you a flavor of it anyway. In terms of voluntary versus paid, it's very important that this be paid. It will almost always start voluntary because it's something new and resources are so tight and everything. But over time, and by time I mean maybe a year or a year and a half, as people begin to see the value of these things, then there is usually a shift that happens if you're doing your job well, involving leaders and the rest of the organization with what you're doing. People begin to see the extraordinary benefits. In our case, in the hospital that I showed you in Kansas, within a year, we had demonstrated savings of nearly $1 million in shorter lengths of stay and fewer complications, which allowed them to then fund an additional position, a nurse practitioner position, to help with the daily collaborative rounds and to help implement things that we talked about in our weekly meetings. So if it's extra, and it will start that way, some of us just have the passion to do it and we'll stay that extra time, but that's not ever the intention. The intention is to build this as a structural part of the normal work. And at first it seems like wasted or duplicate, and then as you start seeing the performance of this interprofessional collective being so much better, then you realize that there was just tons of stuff that you didn't see from that old way of looking at the world. So it very much, similarly, our simulations. When we first began, it was about 18 months ago, the nurses had to come on their own time. They now pay for the nurses to attend and participate because they've seen how much better the performance of the unit is because of these changes. These are excellent questions. Thank you.
Outras perguntas, comentários? Please tell your name and where are you from.
Eu sou Cristina, sou médica de família formada aqui pela PUC e atualmente faço pós-graduação. E pelo que eu entendi da experiência deles, é essencialmente hospitalar. Eles têm uma nova forma de trabalho com pacientes internados. E se eles já produziram algum número em relação a esses pacientes quando eles têm alta, de como isso interfere na vida desses pacientes quando eles têm alta e seguem acompanhamento ambulatorial. Cristina.
Dr. Cristina is a family physician, and she asks about if you have a follow-up of the patients after discharge, if your collaborative model has changed anything for them. And also, this is a system, or this is a model for hospital care, right? Not for ambulatory care.
These are excellent questions as well. And most of our work has been done in hospital care, and also there have been adaptations of this for office care and ambulatory care. The same principles, I think, apply, which is having consistent groups of people working together, opportunities for those people to meet and reflect together, and developing intentional ways of collaborating involving the patient and family. In our particular case, we had significant improvements in the transition to home process as we began doing this. And that took, and also on the intake side, the preparing the patient for surgery, the education of patient and family, and so forth. So it really is, can be applied, and you can see benefits across the continuum. Having said that, there are very significant, if you look at the episode of care of a patient, for example, I'm a heart surgeon, so the patient will come in and with some type of condition, be diagnosed, have surgery, go home, and then eventually be cared for as an outpatient. And you can see even the way that I frame that, the orientation that I have. But across this entire continuum, there are settings. For example, we have an operating room team that is not the same as our ICU team, which is not the same as our post-op floor team, which is not the same as the group of people helping to transition the patient home. And so we find it very helpful to separate those settings and to recognize that the ideal team and teamwork in particular settings is going to be somewhat different, and yet these are all connected across the continuum. So we work across that continuum, but we also work in each setting. So right now in the United States, there is a lot of interest in what's known as the patient-centered medical home. And we are adapting these methodologies and working with people who live in that world in the same way that I live in the hospital world, because, and it's true even from one hospital to another. There's a saying that we joke about, that it's necessary to reinvent the wheel every time. That this local environment is never the same as that local environment. Even if it is the same, people won't believe that it's the same. So people need to work through these things, customizing and making them their own. And so I don't mean to imply that these methodologies will work perfectly across every setting, but I do believe quite deeply now from working with internal medicine outpatient clinics, neurology outpatient clinics, OBGYN outpatient clinic, and some family medicine settings, that the principles make sense and can be adapted. So it's an excellent question. Thank you for that.
Eles têm lá home care service. Não sei se aqui a gente já tem isso, não? Já tem? Mais perguntas? Diga seu nome. Vai falar inglês?
Yes. Can you hear me? Okay. My name is Gustavo. I am a chemical engineer, and I like it very much what our mate Christina has said about the post-work after the patient leave the hospital. He's still having some kind of care, you know. But the most important thing I would like to know is the level of happiness it can cause to a patient. I mean, it can persist for the patient, change the way he sees the life and the way he lives. I mean, how can I say that?
Diga em português.
Em português, eu gostaria de saber como a gente pode fazer essa pessoa levar isso para a vida dela, conseguir transformar o ambiente que ela vive em um ambiente mais humano, que eu acho que a ideia de criar um campo social, na hora que ele diz ali, de praticar uma ação e refletir a respeito disso, quais foram os benefícios, como fazer que isso, não só entrando na parte da interdisciplinariedade, aplicar isso na parte da educação, da política, que é uma coisa muito importante, porque tudo está conectado interdisciplinarmente, transdisciplinarmente, e a ideia seria levar isso não de uma forma só hospitalar, mas levar esse trabalho da pessoa no caso, pro ambiente familiar dessa pessoa. E é isso, perguntar como transportar isso.
Gustavo's question is about the patient will be happy with all this care in the hospital, and how can we manage that he continues to be happy in his life ahead at home?
So first of all, thank you for your excellent English, and I wish that I have zero Portuguese, so I am so grateful for the translation and so grateful for your question. Let me answer it this way, and I don't think I'm answering exactly what you're asking, but the more that we have involved patients in the care, the more we have understood that the primary goal is not our science. The primary goal is what has meaning for the person that we're trying to help and also for ourselves. And this is a revolutionary shift from getting the science right to helping to create meaning and life wholeness for people. In the same way that the hierarchy collapses in collaborative care, this difference between we are the experts and we're trying to, sew your bypass on perfectly and adjust your potassium changes to we are all working together to try to do something that's meaningful and important. We started doing things so differently as we started working in this way. I had one patient, his whole goal was to go to his sister's wedding. He was having bypass surgery, but all he wanted was to go to the wedding of his sister in about 6 weeks. And so we were able as a team to get a van and drive him to his wedding, and several of us actually went with him so that he could experience that event, even though he was still on dialysis and any number of different things. And so, although I may not understand your question exactly, the point that I think you're trying to make of the wholeness and the happiness and the meaning for the person, that actually increasingly, I think, becomes our focus, even in the middle of the most complex medical care in the hospital. And once we start thinking that way and feeling that way as we're interacting with the patients, people's lives are touched by this. Ours are touched, the patient is touched, the family is touched, and none of us are ever the same again. Now that's not to say that there isn't so much more that can be done to make that transition go well and make sure that their care goes well. But if I understand you correctly, what you're talking about is something that has become extremely important to me and that I see more and more clearly every day as we begin working in this level, interprofessional way and actively involving patients and families in the care process. The things that we thought mattered to the patients often don't. And the things that we never thought about because we never listened often matter more than anything.
Qual seria a barreira, o limite? Por exemplo, é uma ciência humana, então é uma ciência extremamente inexata. Então, até onde a gente pode ir para ajudar a pessoa sem invadir a privacidade dessa pessoa? Porque ela tem uma vida, queira ou não, uma vida privada, uma vida que, de certa forma, as pessoas carregam segredos, entre outras coisas que não, elas se sentem um pouco, como posso dizer assim, invadidas quando no caso o profissional de saúde tenta ajudar ela e como é que a gente sabe o nosso limite de poder ajudar.
Okay, so as you involve the patient and the family of the patient to what extent you should go and not invade the privacy of the patient or the family?
The patient should always control all of those interactions. So again, it should be a respectful invitation and a request, and then we try to follow the lead and direction of the patient. What we find is that if we make that invitation respectfully and demonstrate that we are listening and respectful, that almost always the patient will invite us into everything. But the control must always rest with the patient.
Oh, I have a question. You mentioned that your collaborative model should be you have this model in your team, and what about the rest of the hospital? Is it difficult? How do you manage this? And people find it very strange.
Yes. People do what makes sense to them and what has meaning for them. And all of us are products of our training and our past history. At least in the United States, we train very differently than this. We train in professional isolation. Medical students going to be doctors train with other doctors. Nurses train with nurses. Respiratory therapists train with respiratory therapists, and so forth. And only after we graduate do we begin working in the hospital. Even then, the doctors have an area where they often congregate. The nurses have another area where they congregate. The formative conversations that shape what makes sense to us happen in professional silos. And so no wonder we view the world differently. The higher that you are in the traditional hierarchy, the more that you tend to value the crisp, clean care of the medical condition. Talking with the patient and family perhaps is valued only to get to the diagnosis or to get the treatment right, can be seen as a burden. And so that is 150 years of history. And so when any place that you begin to create this, that's the starting place. And also the administrative and organizational structures are designed to support those ways of working. The nurses have a leader nurse who makes assignments. The doctors have their own hierarchy. There are certain rights and privileges that people assume that they should have. And so you then enter in with a very different model. Part of the reason that it's so important to begin with a chance for people to talk and interact is to give people a chance to begin to make sense differently of this. It is still very much a minority. When I first began this work 15 years ago, of my physician colleagues, maybe 5 out of 100 would find this valuable or useful. The world is changing, and it's now 30 or 35 out of 100 that find this meaningful. It's still a minority, but it's a rapidly growing minority that will reach a tipping point at some place, I hope. I don't know. But yes, it is, I can show you 1,000 scars on my back and arrows, and I've lost 1,000 political battles trying to do this work. And anyone across our country or across the world that does this work needs to understand that you are changing very deep professional cultures. And they will rear up and they will fight back. So it's not an easy process. Even as I look at the design of your room today, the room has a platform in front with a table that someone is sitting behind. These are barriers to the kinds of interactions that collaborative care requires, and they are normal in the way, for example, even the rows and the elevated seating and so forth. These are are part of a different era, of a more directive, expert model, as opposed to a layered collaborative model. So sometimes we will physically rearrange the room into a circle or into more comfortable seating so that people can be interacting in different ways. And so that's just one little minor example of all the challenges that you face as you begin to do these things. So it's an excellent question, and but the world is changing. It's changing in so many ways, and this is part of, I think, a very deep shift in our consciousness and understanding. And I don't think it will happen overnight. If you think you can change this in a year or 2 years, it won't happen. You can change the unit culture in that period of time, but to change an entire organization is going to take much more, and to change an entire universal approach to healthcare, this is a 30 or 40-year process. I may not be alive when it's done, but I watch the progress. It's astonishing progress, and it is happening. Even the fact that you asked me to do this is exciting.
Bom, o Dr. Paul fez mestrado em administração em Harvard. You had a master's in administration business school in Harvard, is that right? So I would like to ask you to what extent this experience has helped you to frame and to improve your idea of the collaborative model.
Well, and the degree is in public administration. It was actually at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, which is slightly different than the business school, but it was an extraordinary experience. And the two things that were most helpful were courses in leadership and courses in communication. The leadership course was very interesting, helping us understand that there's sort of two kinds of leadership. There's what the professor referred to as technical leadership and adaptive leadership. Technical leadership is closer to what you might call management. We want to make the trains run on time. We know where the trains are supposed to go. We need to just get that work done. Adaptive leadership is much more difficult. You don't necessarily know the answers as an adaptive leader. You know that somehow what you're working on has to transform. And so most of the work in that particular extraordinary class was about adaptive leadership and how a social system has a level of tension in it that you can sort of monitor in different ways, including your own sense of tension as you're in that environment, and the need to take that tension up to a certain point before productive change can take place, and to know that just above that threshold is another, which is a level of tension that the environment cannot tolerate. And so your goal as an adaptive leader is to modulate that tension so that it stays right in this protective zone, or productive zone. If you don't get to that level, then nothing will change. And if you go too high, you will be assassinated, literally or figuratively. You will be taken out. The system cannot absorb that level of stress. So it's a very interesting process. The other was about a communication course that I took. The professor stressed that for a change message to be effective, that the structure of the change message must match the structure of the desired final result. So we have a violation of that today. We have a single white male physician speaking about collaborative practice. Ideally, I should be here with a nurse colleague, a respiratory therapy colleague, a social work colleague, a patient, and a family member, and we together should be presenting to you about this vision of collaborative practice. So this idea that the message needs to match the desired final result to be effective was very powerful, and every chance that I get, I try to structure things aligned with that. And there were many other. One of the interesting things, too, was about motivations. I deeply think that most policy making entities misunderstand healthcare. Certainly, at least in our country, and I would be willing to bet it's universal. The reason that people tend to go into healthcare is because they really want to do the right thing for their patients and for their community and their society. And I think that is by far the deepest, most powerful force in healthcare. And at least in our country, we're making all sorts of mistakes trying to motivate innovation and change through market competition. And it is devastating to that commitment to doing the best that can be done for patients. I think that healthcare comes out of the root of our being that is reciprocal, and I think that business comes out of the root of our being that is competitive. And when you cross those over, I think that you do some sort of harm to the soul of healthcare. So I was able to sit and watch all these during that time that I studied there and try to think about, how do you make these changes happen at a national level, at an international level, at a local level. So it was an extraordinary experience.
I think we have time for a last question.
Hi, I am Thais. I am a fourth-year medical student here in the university. And my question actually is about in the academic level. I see that your teamwork works very well in the hospital, but I would like to know if you think that in the models that you have now of the teamwork, it would work in academic level with the university students, and if you have any experience with the students working in an interdisciplinary way.
So, if I'm understanding your question correctly, and I understand your English perfectly, I'm just trying to make sure that I understand the direction of your question. It raises some very interesting, fascinating dilemmas. Our education model trains the doctor of the past, which is the person who can diagnose the patient and tell everyone what to do. And so I have a very close friend who is, in fact, he was in the picture, Eli Brumfield. He is the head of medical education at our hospital for internal medicine, resident, and medical student education. And this entire experience was very disturbing to him because he could see how much better this care model was, and he could see exactly how he could teach his students to participate in this. And his dilemma was that if he did, then they would no longer be the all-knowing directive doctor that they are then going to be tested on, that he will be evaluated on producing, and so forth. And so the level of change in both practice and research, which we've not talked about, but is also something to consider, and in education, is profound. And they link together. So in order to really produce this sort of collaborative interprofessional practitioner, the education models need to change. It's very easy to see what those models should be like, and students are thrilled when we create these interprofessional, especially in the simulation settings that we've done. They don't want to go home. They're just having such an amazing time learning from each other and together interprofessionally. And yet the curriculum is not organized in those ways. And all the things that then follow, the testing, the certification, board specialization, and so forth, are all in the old model as well. So that's what happens when those of us live at this time, for no other reason than we are here as these changes are taking place. And I'm talking now over several generations that have happened and are to come. Our responsibility falls in the area of figuring out these new models. Students love working in these ways. We found that the earlier a student is in their training, the more this makes sense. And the more that they are toward the end of their training, when they become deeply in the old culture, then this is very psychically disturbing, because they so much, it's like I've worked for 10 years to tell everybody what to do, and now you want me to sit down and organize a collaborative team? I don't understand. So it makes total sense when you're normal, and then as you get deeper into the culture, it becomes harder to break out of that. But you can absolutely teach in these ways. It's an extraordinary kind of teaching, very rich. Again, as you asked about kind of the happiness or the wholeness or the meaning of the person, that becomes so evident, and students can connect with that so deeply, as well as the technical aspects. So there's an entire story to be written about education, and then, as I mentioned, research is exactly the same. It requires a different kind of understanding of research, and we can talk more about that at another time. But thank you for that question. I hope that was helpful.
Well, Paul, that was a very nice discussion, and it was very nice to hear you, but we are running out of time. And we would like to thank you a lot, and perhaps if you could leave us a final message.
Oh, goodness. The final message is just the privilege of the professions that we are in. I can't imagine a deeper privilege than to have a person entrust their life and well-being to us. And as I see many of you are very young in this room, entering into these professions, so pretty soon you'll be caring for me. And I just feel so happy about the future of healthcare, because I look at the extraordinary people that are coming into healthcare and the amazing work that is being done. So I feel that healthcare is going to be in very, very good hands. This will be your main work, is imagining the new world of healthcare. And it's a profound shift. Your generation will need to learn the old very well, master that, but then leave that behind and create the new. And so I'm hopeful that at least some of this work can help you see a glimmer of a pathway toward that new. And as human beings, we will do this. It'll be very exciting. So thank you again for the privilege of being with you.
Thank you, Paul. O professor Guilherme Mano, você quer dizer uma última palavra, uma última mensagem?
Apenas agradecer o convite, a assistência, e acho que os dados estão lançados. Assim, temos grandes dificuldades e muita necessidade de interação interdisciplinar. Então, imagino que esses seminários, a sua participação, tentando coordenar essa atividade aqui na PUC, seja bem importante para aproximar áreas, né, que poderiam passar muitas décadas sem se tocar, sem se aproximar, e todos precisamos, né? Como essa pequena amostra, assim, uma unidade pequena, de 18 leitos, que é a internação psiquiátrica, é um microcosmos, assim, que mostra a necessidade que deve existir em outras tantas áreas, assim, de haver aproximação e interação.
Obrigado, então, professor Guilherme Mano, também pela presença, né? E just to say that, Paul, the work you have been doing and the publications you have already a big effect in our discussions here with the students, the medical students. And I believe that we have to trust a lot on the young people, because they have the strength to go ahead and perhaps to improve what we have not been able to improve in our lifetime. So it was a great honor to have you here tonight or this afternoon, and thank you. And I think we should keep in contact, because many other opportunities will come in the future, and we would like to have you again with us. Okay, Paul? Thank you very much.
Thank you for the privilege.
Obrigado a todos. Boa noite. Está encerrado.